Hello and welcome to Path to Power, episode 20. I'm Matt Cooper.
And I'm Ivan Yates.
So we're going to talk today about RTE, we're going to talk about data centres, Sinn Féin's recent visit to London to meet the big financial bigwigs in the city, the construction of new hospitals, and bits and pieces of gossip that Ivan and myself have picked up over the week. But we're going to have to start, as ever, with the topic of immigration and where people, when they come into the country seeking international protection, where they go to. Because, Ivan, are you familiar with the game Whack-A-Mole?
Yes. Would you believe it's on my notes?
Okay, because this is what strikes me, that what's happening.
Absolutely a snap.
Okay,
insofar as
and I know
if you bang it down, it pops up somewhere else.
It pops up somewhere else, exactly. It's fun, fair game and the rest of it. And so we had Simon Harris orders that the tented village outside the International Protection Asylum Centre must be disbanded. Got away. It's gotten rid of. Suddenly, a new one emerges, as we predicted on this podcast last week, down on the banks of the canal. Thursday morning, everyone else is going, where's the next one going to pop up?
Well, you mentioned, was it St. Mary's or a particular
church? There's another park down in Ballsbridge,
Yeah. Well, I actually am hearing a few things. First of all, I don't know if you saw the poll at the weekend, but I had said to you that, shock, horror, Rwanda, Ireland do some sort of Rwanda externalisation. I mentioned Algeria and Egypt and so on. 50% of people were in favour of that in the poll at the weekend. I think it was the Sun. I'm not sure. It was one of the Sunday papers.
There's polls everywhere. It's hard to keep track of them.
And secondly, 50% favoured some border presence to stop the porous nature.
Actually, the one thing that was almost amusing in that was that the highest number of party supporters who wanted that border was Sinn Féin supporters.
Indeed, because they don't recognise the border. Now, I have some news for you. I'm told in the inner bowels of government, permanent government thinking on this, which would straddle the Department of Children and Integration, the Department of Justice, and the Department responsibility for housing and local government, have actually come up with a medium-term plan. And just bear with me on this. There's a thing called BOTPS. What's that, Ivan? They are beneficiaries of temporary protection status. And so the line in the sand is the 25th of March 2024. That was the date where Ukrainians had their allowance cut per week from 230 to 38 euros. They're saying that everyone who was settled in before the 25th of March, they're called BOTPS, beneficiaries of temporary protection.
And they remain on the old money, isn't it?
That's right.
It's people coming in after that date who were on a much reduced rate.
And after that date, you're told, well, look, after 90 days, you're on your own. So it's two regimes for Ukrainians, just for Ukrainians. They've come up with the bright idea after the local and European elections that these people who were the ones on the higher money, the ones who were here longest, they're going to give them until the 25th of March 2025 to, one, have their money cut, two, get out of state provision, go find your own, either go home, go abroad, or go and go on the HAP system, and so on.
Sorry, do you know whose idea that was?
Well,
Mary Lou MacDonald proposed that last year.
Okay.
She actually spoke of a cut-off of March 2025 for the Ukrainians.
So what they're saying is they'll all be put on the same footing of the lower money. So they reckon there's something like 76,000 people in this accommodation situation, and they think they'll get 50,000 of them out within a year. Hey presto, you have your accommodation for the international protection people. Is that not a bit of a smart move?
Is that going to sort them out for the European and local elections and the general election?
Sorry, this is going to be the response to the fallout of that election.
Right.
Well, it takes a while for the permanent government to move, to shift their ass into gear. But that's the pace at which they move.
But you see, isn't that the theme, I think, of some of the topics that we're going to be discussing later as well, and this one in particular, is that even when a problem is staring straight in the face of the government and officials, how long it actually takes to actually do something. You get task force set up, or you get various things that are promised that will be done, and they simply aren't done. Everything gets bogged down in planning and financing, or just a lack of actual will to actually get things done.
So I think that's the inertia. It's ever thus, but it's getting worse. More layers of bureaucracy have made things worse instead of better. More interagency bodies and so on. So I think the plan is to either get the Ukrainians to go or to assimilate into society. If they do the latter, right, if they say they're working here and so on.
As many are.
Yes, the long-term pressure is on social housing. Social housing waiting list currently stands at 57,000. It's down from 67,000. Now, the general rule of thumb is in Housing for All, approved housing bodies, local authority, is 10,000 a year. So you don't need to be a genius to work out there's many people going to go on to it as often. But if half of these Ukrainians who have children and so on, actually most of these Ukrainians are now working, right? Obviously children aren't working, elderly people aren't working. Those who can work, by and large, are working.
But are they earning enough to be able to provide their own private accommodation?
And this is where I'm trying to get. So the HAP statistics, the housing assistance payments, that is essentially the rent subsidy. It's about $1 billion a year. How much of that is being paid to non-nationals is the question, and will that increase? But what you're looking at is the pressure point of this shift in relation to Ukrainians is actually, so the rule is you cannot apply for a social house unless you've been here for 5 years. So these guys were briefing me on this, and they said this is the best solution they can come up with. So it's a mixture of all the world as you knew it. We are providing you with accommodation. We are giving you $230 a week. We are giving you a medical card, and all that is going to change. But there will be a cut-off point of 1 year to get your house in order. And that means you can go back to Ukraine, you can go to the UK, you can go to other parts of Europe or whatever. Well, what do you think of it as a plan?
Well, I just wonder about the implementation of it again. Just going something else you mentioned earlier, which sort of grabbed my attention. You said that this poll suggested over 50% of Irish people would be in favour of deporting people to Rwanda.
Or a similar country.
Or a similar country, which I think is quite shocking that we would be so ungenerous in relation to people that we would do that. But I did say to you in an earlier edition of this podcast, I mean, when I saw that back, I think it was in January, that the government was putting out a tender for aircraft to take deportees out. I could certainly see that being very popular on the basis that if somebody has gone through the official channels and has been told they are not being allowed to stay, and that should be the case in many cases, because you can't just say everyone who comes here wants to stay. Even if you believe in immigration, you actually have to believe in it being ordered and managed. I jokingly said to you that I thought they would be trying to get a flight out before the European and local elections. I don't think they will manage to do that, but it wouldn't surprise me in advance of general election if we did see cameras been invited up to Dublin Airport and the press been invited to take photographs of people been sent back home in these specially chartered jets.
Well, I'm hearing from the same people that there's definitely a shift from Simon Harris's regime. That's at civil servant level. There's definitely a gear shift from Leo's regime, whereby the next highest in the rest of the EU was something like €120 a week, and we were given $230. Yeah. And there is no doubt that that Simon Harris is perceived in the corridors of administration as quite right wing on this.
Well, in fairness, now that had been decided before Leo Varadkar stepped down. The change to the Ukrainian rates had been decided a few months ago, and I think the strongest opposition, if I remember correctly, to that came from Micheál Martin, who has been very strong in the whole idea of accommodating as many Ukrainians as possible. And you got to remember as well that one of the reasons I think at EU level why we have made such a big thing about taking in Ukrainians and been generous is because we don't contribute on a military way in that other EU countries who are members of NATO do.
Just when you were doing your math sensitivity almost woke bit there, I had a moment, but I pulled myself together and say, feck this. The point about it is I was listening to another competing podcast, which was a lengthy interview with Owen O'Brien. And I have to say, I just listened to it at face value. Of all the people who expressed humanitarian, sensitive tone like you just did, and our obligations to this, and he spoke about a family of 5 people in a hotel room for a year and the father died, I actually think, because the perception is now getting out there with Sinn Féin's recovering the ball. They're against the Asylum Pact. They're taking a tougher line and all this. That the man at the centre of this is actually really quite humanitarian in his approach.
Well, I think he genuinely
Whereas I'm
believes
not,
in providing as much housing as possible for people and taking into account, as I think has historically always been the case, there are always many people in society who cannot afford to privately provide their own accommodation, so the state actually has to do it for them. And, these people as well can make a valuable contribution in society. I mean, this is one thing I think I would worry a little bit as well about, and you're starting to smirk at me now.
No, I'm smirking at myself. No, because, when I define when you cut a shinner, they bleed, a border pole in 10 years. When you cut
he believes that as well.
Yeah,
he believes that
yes,
very much.
Absolutely. But when you cut a Fine Gaeler, they believe in free enterprise, they believe in a meritocracy, you know what I mean? And they probably believe you shouldn't get a free house anyway.
Sure, hang on, surely, and this is going back into the history, but just sort of the John A. Costello and Gareth Fitzgerald Fine Gael, that an awful lot of Fine Gael people subscribe to, does believe in this social justice and does believe in looking after those who are in not as good a position to look after for themselves.
Just as a ironic note in that, there was one very famous Corkman who was director of elections for a number of elections, and he always had a saying, in rural Ireland, once you hit a town, once you go inside the 30-mile-an-hour zone, you lose Fine Gael voters. All of them are outside that zone. So that whole bleeding heart thing, that may be a temporary strand of Fine Gael, but isn't a long-term
you call it bleeding
DNA.
Heart. You call it bleeding heart, but
That's what it is, yeah.
And I mean, I suppose in some respects, I was reluctant to use the phrase whack-a-mole earlier because we're talking about real people. And we're talking about that an asylum process has to filter between those who genuinely are in fear of their lives and those who are not, who are not in danger, who could be going back to a country where they could continue. But then again, I have a certain degree of sympathy for people who now are disparagingly called economic migrants, because what was every Irish person who ever emigrated? They were economic migrants. They went to the United States, they went to the United Kingdom. And I know that they get this thing, they never expected anything for nothing. They expected loads for nothing. And as I said on this podcast before, I went to school and I went to college with people who, when they left Cork in the 1980s, and the big thing in the conversations in the pubs in Cork would be, you can get everything for free. You can actually go straight on the dole over there and you can continue working and all the rest of it. It's part of the Irish DNA to emigrate for economic reasons.
I was speaking to one Euro candidate who I think will be an MEP, and he said, I'm sick of doing these shop canvases and so on. I want to go to the houses. And he'd say at the houses, just tell me what's on your mind and what people really think. And I can tell you this, but the opinion that you have genuinely and sincerely articulated is a million miles of where the Irish public is. You know my attitude to politics, stick your finger in the air, which way the wind is blowing, and I will reflect that. I am telling you, I have never seen such lack of sensitivity on the migration issue. People feel that we're being engulfed. People feel the government isn't coping. And they're going to vote on the 7th of June accordingly. Mark my words.
Some people. I noticed that the Irish Times does a monthly tracker now of the issues that people are interested in, and migration has gone up to, I think, the top of the poll. Do you know what's fallen all the way down to the bottom? RTE. And I'm just bringing this up because we had this issue in the radio show on The Last Word this week when those 3 reports came out from RT during the week. And I think we gave it, with Ian Guider in the Business News, about 4 minutes of coverage. And that was it, right? It was wall-to-wall in RT itself and perhaps elsewhere in the newspapers. And the following morning, I said to my production team as meeting, did we go a bit light on that? Did we should have done a lot more in RT? And they all went, oh God, no. Who cares?
Well, I'll tell you why you should care. Because in all of these issues, I look at them on their merit and then I look at the politics of it. And I don't know if you've noticed, but Simon Harris and others have said, we're definitely going to make a decision on the future funding of RTE before the recess.
July 11th. That's the key date.
Okay. So, and there's lots of things, they say they're going to do it, but they're not going to do it. So here is the lineup here, and this is the politics of this. Catherine Martin has set her face completely no later than Wednesday of this week on a News at One interview, saying that the model she favours is exchequer funding. slice it and dice it, 240 million of a transfer of resources. This is on top of the 57 million to Tina G. And Tina G are now awash with money. They're actually covering racing like no other station in terms of they're just awash with money. And it's without control. And
I'm sure there's control. I'm sure people from TG Car will be in touch with us saying that they spend their money responsibly because they realise they're a state body.
I'm sure they do. But so what I want to say to you is this. I'm convinced the two key ministers, Finance and Deeper, Pascal and Michael, have privately said to themselves, over our dead body, is this going to be Exchequer thing? But Micheál Martin has made the running on this issue, saying that this wouldn't be good for democracy. You know, a future government who's funding RTE might want a Pravda-type control of RTE. But basically what I'm hearing is this. Catherine Martin is heading directly for an almighty bloody nose on this, because there's going to be no hiding place for her, because the Cabinet are not going to agree to this. Now, there's a number of issues bubbling under where, quite frankly, Fianna Fáil, in relation to the Greens, agriculture and other issues, are just fed up with. And you might have seen Coveney, before he left, issued a number of statements, and something we're going to talk about later, energy and floating energy, and the lack of delivery in relation to that for data centres, and him with responsibility for enterprise was saying that we must, and FDI, we must have a policy on that. But what I'm looking at now is that it may have escaped your notice because you're only giving us scant attention. They gave him another 40 million this week, a dollop at 20. It's like a heroin son addict. No, just keep giving him more money. Well, this is ridiculous.
Actually, this is the point. And actually, I am writing for the Business Post about this on Sunday, despite the lack of interest by my production team in the last word, which I could understand. They thought there were more important issues to cover, such as migration issues and whatever. But it struck me that these three reports that came out, while they're not unimportant, as it comes to the scale of the things facing RT, they're well down the list. Nobody is looking at what the real issue is. We're all talking about how we finance it. The actual thing, and there are clever people in RTE who know this as well, the whole thing is actually, what is RTE going to be in the future? What services can it provide? We're in a situation where fewer people are watching the station despite a growing population. Fewer people are listening to the radio stations despite a growing population.
And the proportion of under 40s, that is accelerated.
Absolutely. And people, I mean, I don't know about yourself, Ivan, but I find myself watching so little what's now called linear television. It's streaming nearly all the time, and I'm in my mid-50s, and I know, look at my kids, and I know what they're watching, and they wouldn't even dream of turning on the 9 o'clock news or whatever and stuff like that. The actual thing is RT needs an absolute root and branch change. It has to actually decide what exactly it's doing in relation to news and current affairs, in relation to drama, in relation to sport, whether it needs things like 2FM, for example. And okay, you could argue that, okay, I would say that because I work for Today FM, which is a direct competitor of 2FM. But 2FM, I remember it being set up at a time when there wasn't youth radio and there wasn't music radio.
There was only Pirates.
There was only the Pirates. So this was set up. But the whole world has changed dramatically. So what is the reason? The newspaper industry, and again, I say this as I write for a couple of newspapers, but I know newspaper editors have for years been tearing their hair out about the fact that as they try and transition to digital, RT has used its licence fee resources and commercial income to set up a website which gets an enormous amount of traffic and takes potential traffic away from the newspapers. So there's issues of competition and fairness, and it isn't fair to the rest of the media if you have various things been done to smooth out the rough edges around RT, but keep throwing money at it when it can be distortionary to the competition provided by private media interests.
Okay, and that is a valid point on its own about fairness in the media space, because RT have all the advantages with the heritage audience when it comes to advertising. But there's a saying in business, every day of the week, culture beats strategy. And what these three reports show to me that the culture of RTE, even under Backhurst, is completely unreformed. How many people, from their 1800, 1900 staff have actually been let go? All the culture of allowances, this funny thing they have of acting up, the bogus self-employment, all of these things of management keeping the board in the dark, keeping the department in the dark. None of these issues have been confronted. If you take over, it's fine, the PAC, the Controller and Auditor General, that is absolutely common sense in these reports. But the decision to simply abolish the TV licence, leaving aside the sort of quick, sort of instant populist hit you get out of that, this is 240 million. Like, the HSE and RTE are different. They have different public requirements and public service requirements. And in my opinion, given what you've outlined in relation to consumption habits, the reality is, and actually they find another 654,000 that in the barter account that they didn't know about. My point is this: I want to say I'm foursquare behind Fianna Fáil in their approach to this. I think Catherine Martin's approach to this is absolutely superficial. It's populist in the short term, but it will create a huge problem. And when Leo came out with this idea, we might abolish the licence, I was totally against it. This is sleepwalking into a future crisis, and it's irresponsible politics.
But sorry. You say sleepwalking into a future crisis. What I'm saying is that the crisis is ongoing, but they're looking at the wrong elements of the crisis, right? They're talking about funding. And yes, you have to talk about funding, but you have to know what you're funding. So you're talking about 240 million direct subvention, which presumably means they would still be out raising money via advertising.
Yes.
But why are we not talking about a dramatically slimmed down RTE, which does specific things which are of public requirement? Now, that
nobody else would do.
You see, yeah, which nobody else would do. And there are plenty of things, in fairness to RTE, and I believe in the existence of RTE, that we do need it, that it is very important, and it does do things that Virgin Television will not do, Virgin Media Television won't do, which likes the Today FM and News Talk and the local radio stations won't do because they don't have the money for it, are things that the newspaper sector, which is increasingly getting into video and audio because of the way that the media environment is changing, but things that they can't do because they can't afford it. But if you have this dramatically changing media environment, I think you've got to confront, well, where does RT sit in this? But what I suspect what's happening is all of the various changes are almost like, well, let's make what is already there better, run better, more efficiently, more transparently. But you're still talking about a size of an organisation that may be way bigger than it actually needs to be. And I think there's a fear of confronting the fact that you might even, and I apologise to anyone RT working there who might feel offended by this and say that it's easy for me to say this. But, maybe 400 redundancies over 4 years is completely inappropriate for what RT needs. Maybe it needs to be double that. Maybe it needs to be treble that. Maybe it needs to be a much smaller organisation with a concentration on things that it can do well. And then that would mean whatever money has to come in from the state and the licence fee is actually less.
And I think allied to that is the absolutely existing successful publisher model that Channel 4 has, whereby they decide to do very good programmes, but they don't do them in-house. They don't have huge administrative, production, direction and other staff to support these. And I honestly think that Backhurst's plan is not fit for purpose, but I think all of these issues, and this is my central point, all of these issues will continue to be evaded if we go for the Exchequer model.
Okay, and I suppose I just want to emphasise again, look, I know we're coming from the private sector, and I will say that there are times in private sector media where it is under-resourced, where there aren't enough people working on particular programmes, or there aren't enough journalists on the news websites or the newspapers and whatever. And
well, working a 4-day week doesn't help.
Where's that happen?
Well, I think if you route into RT, you'll find people work 4 days a week.
Well, there are certain places like that I'm aware of. I'm also aware of that there are people who might be regarded as programme makers who haven't made programmes in years. Layers of administration and management that you wonder that in a leaner organisation where it's a bit like, I suppose you can compare it to the HSE, where we wonder is why are there so many administrators when what we need are nurses and doctors? It's a bit like that perhaps at times in RT. Why are there so many layers of management and administrators?
It's a superstructure. It's not fit for purpose.
Where people haven't moved into when they no longer maybe are making the programs or making the content, to use the modern word, as required. Look, everything is changing, but RT as well is looking to, and I saw this Kevin Backhurst, diversifying into digital and doing type of things like we're doing here in a podcast and the rest of it. But it's almost this thing about let's do more of things while not giving up the things that they already do. And yes, I know they'll turn around and say, oh, well, Fair City has lost an episode a week and it'll be shut down in July and August and the rest of it. But you sort of wonder, well, actually, is that what the cost cutting should be? Is the cost cutting in RT on the right things rather than it actually being actually grasping the nettle and actually cutting the costs that are not relevant to the production of the content
but even
that people
on
see
their
and listen to?
executive board, it could easily be halved. Those roles could be...
They're hiring for executive board positions at the moment.
Don't upset me.
What did you make of the reporting, first of all in the Business Post and then in the Irish Times, of Pierce Doherty in London reassuring investors that if Sinn Féin, when Sinn Féin comes into power, that not all will change dramatically?
Well, I think the devil is in the detail. First of all, there is no doubt if his message is we are not Jeremy Corbyn, we are Tony Blair, you should communicate that message to those who would be very fearful of it. And this is similar to the visit that Mary Lou made to Silicon Valley in 2023 last year. And there's been various business meetings in New York around St. Patrick's Day and so on. So let's dig into the detail. What he is reassuring people on are two things. One, we will accept the EU fiscal parameters of the 3% budget deficit, adhering to the debt rules and so on. Actually, at the time of budget surpluses of 8 billion, that really isn't a big deal. It's not an issue. It's a very low hurdle to cross.
So wasn't there a referendum over a decade ago which effectively forces that upon us?
Exactly. And the second thing they're saying is, and so you can rest assured, we'll observe the fiscal discipline. There's no question we won't have a banana republic. The second promise they're making is, now, this corporation tax regime of 15% and 12.5%, we're not going to touch that either. You need to have no concerns about this. Well, actually, this is all set out in international agreements now at this stage, because the reform in the OECD countries to raise it from 12.5 to 15 for companies over a certain size, even if they wanted to change it, they couldn't. So that's what they're saying in these meetings. And then they're asked specifically about, well, what about the banks? Because you're proposing to increase the levy from 200 to 400 million. And the answer for Pierce on that is right on. Yes, we are, because it's very popular. Nobody likes the banks. Even the clients.
You don't like the banks. Well, you might be with Sinn Féin in this one, Ivan.
Absolutely. So that's the word. On
the banks. So just said he also though did say, and it'd be interesting to see how much the state offloads of its shareholding in AIB before Sinn Féin gets into government.
They won't offload any more shares in PTSB or AIB. That's what they're saying there. So on banking...
But I wonder, what benefit does it actually bring to the state to actually have part ownership of these banks?
Well, a part ownership is the key issue in terms of TSB. What they're looking for is that a state bank will follow political instructions of making capital available, whether it's for mortgages, for SMEs.
Is that a good idea?
No, I'm not, but I'm just saying that's their position.
No, but I'm interested in teasing this out, because I'm also struck by the fact that the tracker mortgage scandal took place at a time when the banks were in state control. That the likes of AIB and Bank of Ireland and Permanent TSB behaved abysmally towards tracker mortgage holders at a time when there were government representatives sitting on the boards of the banks.
But sorry, bring this to Pierce, not to me, because I accept what you're saying. So the next, you see, this is where the rubber hits the road. Because they're using all their verbiage on CPT and fiscal stuff and saying, look, relax, chillax.
They have to do some things for their audience, don't they?
Yeah. And so on the 140 grand, the 3% 3%.
Sorry, this is the income tax threshold of salary before you move to a new surcharge.
And 3% marginal rate added there.
Is it 3 or 4%?
3.
Okay.
They're saying no surrender on that. And also, the clever thing they've done is, so the wealth tax. The wealth tax is
Hold on. No, before you jump onto the wealth tax, because I'm interested, in that there seems to be this idea that income is wealth. Okay, now, I'm going to hands up, and we should both acknowledge that we will both be caught by a 3% surcharge given the
I'm not
income
admitting to anything. I have things wrapped up in companies and so on. I'm actually living in poverty at the moment. But anyway.
No, you're living in Wexford, in a big house in Wexford, in a mansion. Anyway, so
there's so many trusts and so many complications post-bankruptcy with all that. They'll have to get up early in the morning and work late at night to get anything off of me. But anyway.
Anyway, okay. But that actually almost proves my point.
But you're caught anyway. That's true.
My point is,
you're caught red-handed.
Wealth and income are two different things.
In fact, you're probably their number one target. With 700,000 of an income a year, I wouldn't be surprised.
Anyway, the point is, wealth and income are different things, right?
Yeah.
And
they acknowledge that.
Yeah, because and wealth is often tied up in property, and they're against a property tax, which always strikes me as baffling, that the left-wing parties in this country are against the easiest, most obvious way to target wealthy people is to actually levy taxes on the property that they own. But on the income thing, I wonder how a lot of the investors would look at this. Say your multinationals who come to Ireland, often who send people over to work in Ireland, or they have to have a certain levels, they have to bring people in to supplement the Irish management or very senior people in things like data or financial services, whatever, that the 140,000, the extra tax rate, could be something that they will dislike. And there's also special tax arrangements. I think it's called SARF in place,
the SARP,
Yeah, SARP.
For executives.
For executives, which Pierce Doherty has said he will get rid of. Populist, yes, but is that actually good economic planning if we need these companies to be investing in Ireland to be providing the corporation tax receipts upon which any government, including one with Sinn Féin, would depend?
So I'm trying to get the wheat from the chaff here of what they're actually not backing down on, these Davy audiences and so on. And they're also not backing down on the property taxes, which will be in terms of the 14 billion of investment that we've spoken about to build the 50,000 houses a year. They're saying a rent cap, they're saying an eviction ban, moratorium, all of which will result in a flight of capital. The interesting one is the wealth tax. So the wealth tax, as proposed, is that if your assets, liquid or illiquid, so if you had money in the bank, if you have a yacht, if you have a house and so on, if it's over, this is what it says on paper, over $1 million a year, you'll pay 1%. So therefore, you 10 grand is it that you would pay on that a year. And if you had 5 million, you pay 50 grand a year. What they're now saying about that is, well, there could be administrative difficulties and we will propose a commission to look into this. Like the Housing Commission, which was promised by Fianna Fáil in the last election, is due to report in the next 2 weeks.
You've been telling me that it's due to report the next 2 weeks since we started this
my
podcast.
point is, this is
20 weeks ago.
This is 2024. The promise was made in 2020. So good luck with that one. I think the wealth tax is the one that they are actually doing the soft shoe shuffle on, because once it's tied down in the commission, they can argue we're moving towards a destination, but at the same time, you're not actually sending any bills out.
But what was the tax Michael Noonan did? Didn't he put a levy on pension funds? At one stage, that was a form of wealth tax.
Yes.
And that was very unpopular.
Yes, but it raised a bit of cash. So what I'm saying is just let's distinguish between what they're saying to these audiences. So I think on property tax, they have a very difficult message. On wealth tax, they're going easy. But on high earners, you're in for it.
Yeah, okay. Of course, the interesting thing, though, is that depends on who they go into government with.
Yeah, it's a programme for government negotiation.
Because what happens then, if they're going in, say, for example, with Fianna Fáil, would Fianna Fáil be happy enough to say, 140,000, the extra 3%? So that
or they may not be happy. Or you could have Michael McDowell and a group of independents. It depends. So I actually think after the general election around the 15th of November, it'll be lucky if we have a government by Patrick's Day.
Yeah, no,
Because there's a lot of negotiation
funny,
to be done.
this is something that I've argued myself, that funnily enough, that I think Simon Harris, the only thing that could keep him in office until he wants maybe the year out of it, is the fact that he could be a caretaker to Taoiseach.
And also he can argue because he won't be a party to the negotiations, he's not trying to form the next government because Fine Gael will opt out. He'll actually say he's an honest broker in keeping the state between the ditches.
Which also raises the question of how much will get done between now and Fine Gael going out of power. Because you mentioned earlier about Simon Coveney and sort of maybe a few digs he took on the way out as Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment before he was replaced. And I wonder if in time that is something that Simon Harris will come to regret. But he took a few digs about, the pace of getting things done. Data centres, there was a fascinating interview with the head of Amazon in Ireland in the Business Post last week, who sort of broke cover because they're normally quite low key in relation to their web services business, which is so important, and their requirement for data centres. And these data centres, I mean, they're for many people, they're the bête noire of energy waste and the rest of it. Although, as they point out, most of the time, they're the ones who are actually funding the construction of wind farms and solar plants to actually power them. They look for gas and diesel generators as backup in the event of a breakdown. But the investment that we're getting in these new environmentally friendly energy, it tends to be financed by the big multinationals over here. And yet we're doing everything to actually stop them from actually building more of them.
So I think this was a very important interview, because the three big players in this, Amazon, Google and Microsoft, are represented by Michael McCarthy, the former Labour TD within IBEC in Cloud Infrastructure Ireland. And they very rarely speak out. And I think to their own detriment, because things need saying. And remember, some of these companies are bigger than countries, in terms of their country's GMP versus their gross national revenue, international revenue.
Sorry, just on that, Apple is doing a share buyback of about $110 billion worth of stock. And we go on about the 14 million euro that we've got in an escrow account in the tax thing. They're actually buying back shares about 10 times the value of that tax money. So
just focusing this interview in the Business Post with Lorcan Allen and Kathleen Gallagher with Neil Morris, who is the Amazon and AWS is their whole cloud business.
Amazon Web Services.
Right. So he is their head of European cloud infrastructure operations. And he basically said that the edict from Eamon Ryan that says you can only have carbon neutral data centres approved going forward. There's 40 already approved for which there isn't provision.
And can they get on the grid?
Well, there's that problem. But the issue has been that EirGrid have given, and the government have given temporary exemptions for gas generators in the last 12 months, simply to get over the hump. But basically, what he's saying in this interview, that Amazon employs 4,200 people here. They've already invested and stimulated economic activity of 11 billion here. This is not small potatoes. And they're saying that the pace of pipeline in which they operate, they have to be sure that they're open for business. Now, the CRU, if you're waiting for the regulator authority to do something on this, they're just moribund, in my opinion. They're useless. But the reality here is this, that in a recent debate I was listening to on the Claire Byrne show, where Michael was talking about this, there is a presumption by all of these good people that by 2030 we will have offshore wind. and the two major wind farms are Array and Codling. I was speaking to someone from a very informed authority who actually believes the Array project will never happen. The reality is that the earliest all this will happen is 2035. Now, there simply is no electricity in place.
This is an absolute waste. This is actually a national scandal. There is the potential to generate enough wind energy that we would have not just enough energy for ourselves. We could supply 8 times that amount and be supplying it to the rest of Europe.
So
there is phenomenal
absolutely.
opportunity.
There's a potential of 100 gigawatts off the West Coast.
Yeah.
But so just to give you a picture, as of 2022-3, up to last year, the total metered usage of electricity in Ireland, domestic, industrial, across the board, was 30 gigawatts. So we have a plan over this, between now, 6 years left, to have an extra 9 gigawatts of onshore wind before the offshore wind, which is more than that. And from solar, we have 1 gigawatt. So the reality of the situation is we have a tech industry which are going to be reliant on data centres. They have 140,000 jobs in this country. They are consuming at the moment somewhere between 18 and 20% of our total electricity output. Now, this is just the first pinch point. But let me tell you, in reality, we have signed up to a thing called RED 3. This is a Renewable Energy EU directive, which says on the 1st of July 2024, in a matter of weeks, we are going to comply with 42% of our entire energy consumption will come from renewable sources. Like the Minister for Energy, what is he actually doing by way of follow through to ensure that planning permission is got between Bord Pleanála, county development plans and judicial reviews? Because the output we have is a measly 300 megawatts a year. And the interconnector, the Celtic interconnector, is only 600 megawatts a year. So the fact of the matter is that all of this requires a radical implementation so say you go with this. Yes, we must have low carbon this. We must have 80% renewable electricity. The government are actually the people who are providing the obstacles to delivering that power resource.
See, we also have government by announcement a lot of the time. And this goes back to the previous government and this one of the last 4 years. All of these things, strategies are drawn up and then plans are announced for implementation, and then everything falls behind schedule. So we have it in relation to the provision of the wind farms and infrastructure. We have it in relation to, for example, new private hospitals or new state-run elective hospitals, which were promised years ago for Dublin, for Cork, for Galway.
That's right.
And they are years behind schedule.
Well, would you believe it? Last week, not this week, this guy, Eamon Quinn, who's, in charge of every project over 100 million in hospitals. And he actually made a presentation at this summit. And he was
This is at the infrastructure
Yes,
summit.
it was quite impressive, to be honest with you. He said the sites have been put in place. Now, the idea is there would be 4 what they call elective hospitals. So you won't have an overnight stay. Everyone, there's adults only.
Takes an awful lot of pressure off the hospitals where you have more major surgery and where they have the emergency departments.
Exactly. So the idea is, and they would be within a mile or two of a grade 4 hospital in case you had an operation and you couldn't go home and and discharge. So he says that's on target to happen.
On target? What target? The target keeps moving all the time.
He said that they're going to open the surgical hubs in Mount Carmel and Swords before that, and the particular sites are Crumlin and Blanchardstown for the 2 Dublin ones, as well as Cork and Galway. And basically he's saying, of course, don't hit me with the baby in my hands, which is the National Maternity Hospital. And he's saying that mega project, which is, something akin to the National Children's Hospital, is going to go to tender in the next quarter.
Okay, which is great. But, we had the rows about the lands a couple of years ago in relation to this.
That's sorted. I asked him about that. He said that's sorted.
I know that's sorted, but the point is, how long does it take to get everything done? I mean, these announcements have been made, and this is why the government, if it goes out of office, has nobody but itself to blame for creating the expectation of things that will be done and then not actually getting them done. I mean, I know I keep banging on about prisons and stuff like that, but they keep making announcements about additional prison spaces, about additional beds. How long does it take to get things done? And
no, it's gone from 8 years to 15 years.
Yeah.
They've actually measured this. Major infrastructure projects have gone to 15 years.
But yet, some major projects get done.
That's from conception to completion.
Yeah, but hold on a second. Again, let me just give you the example of, and we've used it before by comparison, with the National Children's Hospital, which they're unlikely to get open and working. And I believe now they're having problems as they are trying in advance to find staff for it. They may not have staff to open it in time. The usual problem.
That happened in Beaumont. Do you remember that?
Yeah. So this is what's happening now at the National Children's Hospital to further delay it. But BAM, who were the major contractor on the National Children's Hospital, were also simultaneously the major contractor on the Intel factory down in Maynooth. The Intel factory in Maynooth got built on time. You have all the various issues in relation to planning, and you have to get the supply of facilities and stuff.
The same for Intel, you're saying, as for others.
They got it done.
Yeah.
When private enterprise sets down a deadline, okay, to get the now, there are times when they, like with all the house builders, where they get caught up in the planning process and they do suffer their own delays. But when they're incentivized, they're motivated to get the shovels in the ground and to get the building work done, and they get it done a damn sight faster than the state does, which actually will be a big issue, I think, for bringing up with the parties looking for power in the general election, who are going to be suggesting a bigger dependence on the state to do provision, because that'll, I think, will be a major talking point is, what gives you confidence that the state will be able to deliver all the various things that you promise?
So if you look at the track record of within budget, on time, within schedule, the example you give in the contrast is absolutely correct. What actually happened, I think, with the National Children's Hospital, there was an element of mission creep as they built it. Oh yeah, we'll take some of those and we'll take more suites of this and whatever. But there are 2 cases of litigation, I understand, between the contractors and the government in relation to that. Now, back on the hustings, because people are out canvassing night and day.
A bit of gossip.
Yes. Well, the first thing is that I hear now that Alan Kelly, who has gone off the radar, and
the former leader of the Labour Party,
but he hasn't gone off the reservation.
Were you expecting him to retire like
I was unclear.
leaders?
I was unclear because he was ousted unceremoniously by Batchik and all of those. It didn't result in any poll bounce. You know, he was called AK-47. But I hear he has now told them don't be looking for another candidate. He will be standing in the general election in North Tipperary, the 3-seat constituency. That's the first bit of gossip.
Tough win, but does he have a big popular support in the area?
Well, put it like this. I think of all the Labour candidates who have, how many will Labour get is the question. They got 6 the last time. I would.
Could you imagine if there were just 2 Labour TDs in the next?
There could be none.
But imagine if there were 2, himself and Ivana Bacik sitting together.
Well, if Michael McDowell stands, I don't think that's going to happen. But either way, I think Sinn Féin could eat her lunch, and Kate O'Connell is coming back into the big.
Is she coming into that constituency?
She's going to be added. She's going to be added by
to James
Simon.
Gagan.
They're joined at the hip. You know that. But anyway, the other bit of gossip I heard is that. On the hustings, there is no doubt to me that what I said to you previous weeks, that the biggest potent factor in terms of the whole European elections is it's a referendum on the asylum pact. It's all about migration. Where do you stand as a candidate on that? And Sinn Féin are actually starting to recover in the polls. They took our advice since December. Get your hand fixed on this. But what I'm hearing at the doorsteps is that, and on the hustings, that Nina Carberry is actually making quite a bit of progress. And for the one Fine Gael seat there, that she is getting some of Mairead McGuinness's vote. I'm hearing that Chris McManus is ahead of Michelle Geldenu. Not impossible for them to get 2 seats because they're very strong in the border counties in that constituency. But I'm hearing the way the people who are opposed to Peadar Tobin have twisted it. Well, no, sorry, you're not voting for Peadar. You're voting for his sister. Because she would be the substitute candidate, and they're getting that across pretty effectively. Kieran Mullooly not making the impact that Niall Boylan is making, because on his doorstep is Luke Ming Flanagan. And Luke Ming Flanagan has been in the Parliament for 10 years. He will, wait till you just look at the he's able to get the column inches when he most needs them. He could disappear for 3 years, but he'll find some row or some spat to, pole vault himself into the middle of the campaign. So I'm saying that it's starting to become a little clearer, and I think Barry Cowan will get the Fianna Fáil seat, but he won't get it on the first count.
In Dublin, somebody who we forgot to mention in our list of candidates last week who entered the fray late, Brendan Ogle.
Yes.
Brendan, I imagine, will pick a few fights in the next few weeks, particularly with the likes of Claire Daly and Niall Boylan. I'd imagine he will be a pretty effective bare-knuckle fighter when it comes to actually...
But is he living in Dublin?
Yes.
First of all, I like Brendan. I know. I thought he was up in Drogheda.
He's from up there, but he actually lives in Dublin.
Well, no, I used to fight with him on air back in the day, pure contrarian stuff, and it was great Punch and Judy stuff. But I always liked Brendan, but his main claim to fame was in an era of consensus with the unions in the public sector, whereby they all hung together, Forza, SIP2, rationalisation. He was absolutely an outlier of being against all that centralist approach and nearly always against every pay agreement, and made a name for himself. But he had bad health now in the last few years.
He's had cancer. He did a magnified podcast with me about a year ago, which was absolutely fascinating, talking about his experience with that. I think he will be a fighter, particularly in relation to...
But he's out of the Corbyn copybook, isn't he?
A bit, but he'd be very strong on the migration issue. He will,
Not my cup of tea, really.
He will fight for the migrants, and he'll also be very strong. Big time. And he will also fight in relation to housing issues. Here, I'll throw a bit of gossip to you. Somebody said to me last week, very interestingly, they heard your prediction about Billy Kelleher as potential Fianna Fáil nominee for the commissioner. And they said to me, do not rule out Michael McGrath. And we said, well, we've discussed this. And they'd heard us discussing Michael McGrath on the podcast. And they said, well, you didn't take into account family reasons why he might go for the European Commissioner's job. The family reasons being his brother.
Seamus,
who has been a former mayor of County Cork, although he's in the South Central constituency.
Carrigaline is his base, very strong.
Very large thing. So the speculation is that he has been waiting patiently and saying, no, Michael, you're never going to be leader of Fianna Fáil probably. You can go off and take the commissioner job and you can let me move into the TD seat. That he sees himself as being Micheál Martin's running mate at the next election because brother Michael has already headed off to be the commissioner.
Well, my understanding was that months ago that was mooted, and that in recent weeks coming up to the Ardèche, he not only had rejected it at that time, but he has firmly rejected it now. The only other thing I'm hearing from the Dáil Bar, which is a pretty reliable source of information, that Dara O'Brien is still harbouring hopes of being the next Fianna Fáil leader and will certainly be a candidate.
Actually, and we're gone way over time, but I was very interested in him coming along and writing to commission them on about the moratorium for broadcasters, because this is something I got caught on the last word. Anytime you have an election, we're not
It's
allowed
anachronistic. It should be gone,
So basically, because it's a 2:00 cutoff, that means from that previous day's programmes...
It's like the picking of the date of the election. It's all about you, Matt.
Of course it is.
Your timing between 4:30 and 7:00.
It's all about my listeners, Ivan. It's all about the listeners.
The national interest.
Who are denied the opportunity
don't limit yourself to the market.
Hear coverage of what may be the big breaking political story of the day because it might interfere with the elections and the day. But in the era where I could be stopped discussing it with anybody on my radio show.
And even on polling day.
Yeah, and on polling. But we could come record a podcast and issue the broadcast, as I think we did on the referendum day. We actually recorded it on the Friday morning. It was out at 4:00 before thing. And, we can take to social media, or I can write a column in the Business Post, which appears online and the rest of it.
So my understanding is Commission Le Mans, the BAI have said they're going to do a test run of different things and observe it for the local and generals, and for the local and Europeans, but for the general election, the moratorium will go, I'm told.
Has to. Particularly with some of the stuff that's going on social media and the misinformation.
The deplorables.
The deplorables, exactly.
Who love you. Nearly as much as you love them.
That is all from this episode. By the way, I have been reading your many comments that have been coming in and questions to mail@pathtopowerpodcast.com. We will get to them, I promise. There are loads of really interesting ideas there. Thank you for the compliments. Not all are complimentary. Some of them are giving out that I'm too woke. Some are giving out that Ivan has no heart. Anyway, all of those things, keep them coming to mail@pathtopowerpodcast.com. Don't forget, please, to recommend us to a friend. You can actually follow us at Spotify, Apple, wherever it is you get your podcasts, available on YouTube, where you can follow us as well, and it'll automatically download for you. But please recommend. You must be doing it because the numbers are climbing every week. More and more people who are tuning in. So from me, Matt Cooper.
And from me, Ivan Yates.
Thank you very much for being with us. Until the next time.